Hi, and welcome to Slaying the Boggart, taking controls of your fears. This is an amazing event that is being hosted by Community Now magazine, and I welcome you. My name is Adette Lacerte, and I'm going to walk you through the slaying of the Boggart today. So let me tell you a little bit about who I am first, and we'll get right into it. So I have a company called 9 3/4 Coaching, and I coach Potterheads. I coach people who are lovers of the Harry Potter series, and most of those people tend to fall into the Generation Zs, so I also coach them as well. And I coach you not to settle for second best in your life. So often I find that our younger generations, before you hit double digits, are full of energy and vitality, and then something happens around the time you start hitting double digits and you lose connection with the magic that's within. And I help you reconnect with that magic and stop settling for second best in your life. Now, I have a long history of all sorts of education and knowledge that I've gathered over the years. But what you do need to know is that I'm a proud Slytherin. I am a Harry Potter fan. I've got 30 years of experience with Girl Guides of Canada, and I actually am a certified professional life coach. Let's dive into this. I want you to take out a piece of paper and to have some pens and markers handy. And I want you to write down on your page right now all of the emotions that you can possibly think of. What are emotions that you're currently experiencing? What emotions have you experienced in the past or that you're aware of? Far too often when we meet somebody for the first time or we're seeing somebody that we haven't seen for a while, we will ask them, how are you doing? And the responses we get back often are fine, good, bad, but good, fine, and bad don't define anything. They don't tell us anything about how the person is doing. What is their emotional state? And so I really want you to start to connect with what are the emotions that you know of? What is there for you? Take the time, write those down for yourselves. And if you have to stop this video along the way, feel free to. Now, some of the emotions that you might have written down include anger, disgust, sadness, happiness, and joy, and love and pride. Those are all awesome words to describe how our emotions are. And we need to learn to define those emotions, but we can't define them unless we know how it feels within us. So, how does sadness feel as compared to happiness? Well, for me, sadness almost feels like a wet blanket. It's covering over top of me and it weighs me down, makes me feel small. Whereas if I'm thinking about joy, I'm thinking about like little bubbles popping around inside of me. There's so much going on, there's energy flowing everywhere. And I think of it as being different from happiness, where happiness has a sort of peacefulness to it, not so much energized like joy. But we need to learn how to identify those emotions. How does your body feel when each emotion comes through you? When we learn to identify them and we label them, and then with the label, we get choice. How long do I want to stay in this state? How long do I want to experience this particular emotion? It's okay for us to experience sadness, but it's not okay for us to live in it. So if we're in a place of sadness, we could set a clock, look at our watch and go, oh, I'm going to give myself 2 hours. After 2 hours, I'm going to move on. I'm going to move into a different state. Or maybe if it's a really heavy day and there is a lot of sadness there, we can say, oh, okay, today I'm going to experience sadness. But tomorrow morning, we're going to put that aside and I'm going to work on focusing on another type of emotion. We're going to move through this because we don't want to live in any one emotion for too long. And that goes for happiness and joy. If we're living in happiness and joy, we're not fully experiencing what it is to be human. The human nature is to have all of these different emotions and to experience all of them. Now, far too often when I'm working with clients, the emotion that tends to come up is stress. Now, stress is a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances. It's a lot of words and kind of doesn't say a lot to me as to what it is. I like to think of stress as being a response due to fear. So, what's fear? Well, what happens with fear is that our senses, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, our hands, collect data. That data then goes to our brain and it gets processed. And when it gets processed, it will identify what we're feeling. It'll put these packages together, and this little bundle happens to maybe represent fear. And when we're experiencing fear, then it causes stress. And there are good stress and bad stress. Some stress is very motivating and pushes us forward to accomplishing goals, while other stress, well, that can be really uncomfortable and it can cause us a lot of distress. So let's have a look at stress a little bit further. Or sorry, let's have a look at fear a little bit further. So I think of fear as two main components. The first one being real fear. And real fear is when our physical form, our body, is at risk of injury. So if we're walking across the sidewalk and a car comes zooming towards us, our physical form is at risk of injury. And if our physical form is at risk of injury, we need to take action right away. And our brain will kick in and allow for that to happen. Now, if we are in a different type of fear, what's called perceived fear, our brain behaves exactly the same way as it would if it were real fear. But perceived fear shows up in things like writing an exam, giving a speech, being in an uncomfortable situation. And our brains start to behave exactly the same way as if we were crossing that street and a car was coming racing towards us. Now, there is a third type of fear, and that's phobias. And that's when our fear becomes rational. And we can look at things like arachnophobia, fear of long words, fear of mother-in-laws, fear of heights. And as we go into our vaccination stage of COVID, it might be fear of needles. Now, I don't deal with fears. That's outside of my realm as a coach. But if you have one of these phobias and you do want to work through them, I do recommend you go and talk to a counselor or a psychologist or somebody who specializes in a cognitive behavioral therapy technique. They have some really cool tools now that can help you manage and navigate through phobias. So let's get moving on here. On your piece of paper, I want you to sit down and write out three things, just three things that you know happen to your physical body when you're experiencing fear. What happens to you? How does it feel? How does your body react? Get like really comfortable. Think about all of the different elements. What might be going on inside of your body? Got a few moments? You can certainly pause if you need more time. Some of the things that you might be experiencing include fight, flight, or freeze reflex, the three Fs. And that's where you want to run away from whatever's there. So if we're in the car, like if the car is coming streaming towards us, we want to run away from it. Maybe we want to fight it off, right? Something's coming at us and we want to fight it off like a saber-toothed tiger. Or sometimes we freeze, and that can be that our body physically freezes and we can't move, but sometimes it's our brains freezing, and we can't even remember our own names, let alone answers to a quiz or an exam that we're writing. That can be a response. We might notice our heart rate changes, and when our heart rate changes, it tends to get really rapid and it can be really hard. And so it feels like it's pounding away at your chest. And it might even feel like your heart's going to jump outside of your chest. It's pounding so hard. We might notice that our breathing changes. So our breathing becomes short and shallow. And we start breathing in this top half of the lungs. Now that can be a real problem because when we do that, we start to hyperventilate. We're not getting enough oxygen to our brains, and then it causes this episode of hyperventilation. So breathing up here, not really great. We might notice our bodies start to shake, and we can shake all over our whole bodies uncontrollably, or maybe it is a voluntary type of shaking. So sometimes when I'm in fear mode, if I'm sitting at a desk or a chair, I'll put the pad of my foot on the floor and then I'll begin to bounce my knee up and down. And that bouncing, that is a voluntary shaking that I'm creating. It's allowing for that fear to escape out of my system and help me manage that. We might experience adrenal surges, and this is where energy is flowing through our bodies very rapidly, but it kind of feels like we're itchy from the inside. It's the easiest way to explain it. And that itchiness makes us want to move our arms and legs. We need to move around in some sort of way just to get that energy out of our systems. And then we have racing thoughts. Now, the racing thoughts, the problem is that they don't go to the best case scenario. So if we're going into an exam, our thoughts don't go to the place of like, I've got this. I'm going to ace this exam. I'm on top of my game. If we're in fear mode, our brains go to the opposite end of the spectrum and they go to the extreme where like, I'm never going to remember anything. I'm so going to fail this exam. But there's a big gap between the two. And what's more likely to happen is something in that middle ground. And so we need to understand that that is how fear is affecting us. And we want to gain control of that fear. So how do we do that? Well, we start by identifying it. And we think of it as a boggart. So if we're in the Harry Potter series, Prisoner of Azkaban, Professor Lupin introduces his class to a boggart. Now the boggart, he is captured inside this large wardrobe. And he tells the class that it likes to hang out in dark corners, recessed spaces, right? Like uncomfortable spaces. And he's captured it inside this wardrobe. But fear does the exact same thing. It likes to hang out in the dark recesses of our brain. And then it does surprise attacks when we least expect it. Now, in Professor Lupin's class, he has each of the students come forward to work on addressing their boggart and to navigate through that process. The first person to come through is Neville Longbottom. And Neville fears Professor Snape. He fears every form of him, and that's exactly who comes out of that wardrobe, Professor Snape. Now, when it comes to Ron's turn, Ron fears spiders. And it's not a little itsy bitsy spider that comes out of that wardrobe. It's a giant spider. It's huge and it's hairy and it's scary and it's uncomfortable. Now, Ron may have gotten his turn, but Harry doesn't get his turn in the classroom. He later ends up going to talk to Professor Lupin in his office. And they were in a discussion. And Harry says, I think that my boggart actually is the Dementors. And the Dementors were the creatures that sucked all joy and happiness from us. They gave us the kiss of death. They sucked all of that joy and happiness right from our souls. And Professor Lupin, very wisely, he tells Harry, I think that you are afraid or you fear in and of itself. Now, the physical form of my boggart is a 7-foot giant Viking, just like the picture here. It's got a snake, he's got a shield, he's got a sword, he's got the helmet with the horns on it, and he is my worst fears. So in order for us to work with your fears, we first need to start to identify them. The first thing I want you to do on your piece of paper is to write down the fears that are causing you the greatest amount of stress. What are the things that come to mind when you're going in to write an exam, or you're having to give a speech, or you're in an uncomfortable environment? What is that inner voice, that inner narrative saying to you? Now, there's lots of different ones that are out there. We can have fear of success, fear of failure, fear of looking bad, fear of not fitting in, fear of looking like a loser. That one actually is mine. It's a big, tough one that I deal with. Fear of not measuring up, not fitting in. There's so many great ones that are out there. And they're all valid. Every single last one of them is valid. What's your inner narrative saying? I want you to write down as many things as you can possibly think of that you might be hearing. Now, I remember some of the people that I've coached, they are talking about fear of the unknown, fear of not understanding. There's lots of good ones out there. Write them down, and if you need to pause, again, take the time to pause and continue on when you're ready. Now, on your sheet, I want you to circle or star or check mark the one message that is the biggest, most predominant message. Which one of those messages just turns your stomach in knots, makes you feel the most uncomfortable that you can? And taking that message, I want you to imagine that it has a physical form. So my of not of being a loser, feeling like I'm fear of being a loser, my physical form is that 7-foot giant Viking. Now, your physical form can be anything. It can be a person, it can be a thing, it can be an animal, it can be an anime, whatever that is for you. Think about what is the physical form that your boggart might take on. Fear of not of the unknown might be a box that you can't see into. Some people think of their fears as a blob. It's like they don't know what it is. But then we have other fears that are very predominant. We know that it's like a measuring tape, right? If I'm not measuring up, some sort of a measuring tape might show up. And then I want you to draw. So on a fresh piece of paper that you have, I want you to draw out what your boggart would look like. I want you to identify it. What does it look like? Write out all of the details around it. What does it have? Like, does it have a Viking helmet, a sword, a shield, whatever that is? Now, I'm not a good artist, and so I use the stick figure method. And in the stick figure, I do my stick figure and I write the words around to describe it. If you're artistic in nature, I want you to take the time to draw it out with all the artistic details that you can. You can start with a rough draft right now as you're going through this video and add to it later. If you're not a great drawer like me and you're using the stick figure method, I want you to later go back to the internet, find some screenshots, some clip art, and paste the image of your boggart over top of it. And once you have an image, I want you to then start thinking about what are you going to name your boggart? What name comes to mind for your boggart? Now, I have 3 rules around our boggarts. We are not to name it after a current bully. We're not to name it after a past bully. And we're not to name it after a family member. If we do that, we have a tendency to project the energy that we have associated with our boggart onto that person. That person is not entitled to that energy. They do not deserve it. They do not own it. Do not give it to them. We do not want to give them power that they are not entitled to. I want you to choose a name that is quite unique, something that will describe your boggart the way you want it to. So my boggart's name is Grundle. Now, Grundle, I've chosen that name because to me it sounds Norwegian. That's my background. It sounds masculine. That's the character that I've created. Yours can have any gender. And for me, Grundle has a guttural sound in my throat. It kind of feels and sounds yicky, gross. And that's the type of feel I wanted for my boggart to have. I wanted it to have all of these details. Now, with every storyline, we need a heroine. We've just finished spending a little bit of time creating our villain in a storyline. And that's the first part of a storyline that we create. Now we need to get into the hero and the heroines. Who is your hero? Who is the heroine that you look up to? Somebody that you admire their values, somebody that you admire their actions, somebody that you look up to because they're brave, they're strong, they're confident, all of those features, I want you to look for somebody who you can reflect on. Now, that person can be somebody who's fictional. It can be somebody who's real. It can be somebody who's within the Harry Potter series or external to the Harry Potter series. So examples that I often give include Hermione Granger, Harry Potter, but then outside you might think of somebody like Anna Green Gables, maybe an anime character. If you're looking at real life characters, you might want to consider somebody like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or maybe the Obamas, or even maybe somebody closer to home, your mom, your dad, an aunt, or an uncle, or a community leader that you have. And as you're imagining that person, I want you to imagine, what do they look like? How do they stand? How do they conduct themselves? How do they behave? What is their posture? Do they have superhero powers? Magical ones. Now, if you were talking about somebody like the Obamas, you might consider their superhero power to be something a little not so obvious, but a legal book or a law book could be theirs, versus if you're in the magical community and you've got a wand. So really get comfortable with your hero or your heroine. And as you do so, I want you to imagine yourself stepping into their shoes. What would it look like if you were to physically step into their shoes? How does it feel to step into their shoes? Does it change the way you stand? Does it change your posture? Do you hold your head higher? Do you take on a superhero pose, hands on your hips, maybe raised above your head? What does that superhero pose look like? What does your hero look like? What does your heroine look like? Stand in those poses. Get comfortable with it. Get really strong in that pose. And as you do so, I now want you to think about drawing yourself as that person. So draw yourself in as that person. Draw them, but put your face in place of them. And so this summer, this past summer, I actually did a photo shoot, and I dressed up as Professor McGonagall because I think that she's pretty cool. And I look up to her as a heroine. So in my backyard, I donned my robes, I pulled out a wand, I put on my witch's hat, and I stood in a power pose. I got really comfortable in that, and how strong that was and how powerful it was, just looking at all those characters. Now, again, if you're not great at art, don't worry about it. Draw a stick figure, work from your stick figure, write out all of the words and details that would describe your stick figure. What is their pose? What are they wearing? What is their demeanor? What does it all look like? Be prepared to then go back to the internet, find some images off of the internet, and then superimpose your face over top of those images. Put you as the hero, you as the heroine in your story. So we got the villain we did with the BOGGART. We're creating the hero and the heroine in our storyline. The next part of this is we need to bring the two together onto the same page. And I want you to draw a picture of the two coming together, your villain and your heroine. And in those moments, in that moment, you need to thank and acknowledge your BOGGART. We need to acknowledge it, because if we fail to acknowledge it, it will get bigger, louder, noisier, whatever. It's just going to become like really difficult not to acknowledge it. And that's the problem, is if we don't acknowledge it, it just gets bigger and more cumbersome and more difficult to deal with. But if we take the time to acknowledge it, then it says, oh, okay, you at least see me, you're aware of me. And the reason it's trying to get your attention, the reason it's trying to be as noisy as it is, the reason that it's being as cumbersome as it is because it thinks that the fear you're experiencing is a real fear and your physical form is in danger, and it wants to warn you. So by thanking and acknowledging it, we take that away from our BOGGART. We say, Thank you very much. I really appreciate that you're here. I hear you, I see you, I acknowledge you, but I'm in charge and I can handle this. This isn't a real fear. I can do this. So what does it look like for you? Maybe you're curtsying, maybe you're bowing, maybe you're high-fiving, fist bumping. For me, it's I see you, I got you. Thanks for very much for showing up. I appreciate you coming to the game. I appreciate you trying to be uh, protective of me, but I got this. I'm good. I'm the hero here. I can handle this. And once you've done that, then we need to start looking at what our next steps will be. I want you to think about what is the weapon that you will use as your hero, as your heroine. What weapon are you going to choose? What is what is your boggart's weakness? What is the thing that's going to take them down? What will you use? And then imagine yourself and get ready to start drawing this. Imagine yourself in an advance and strike pose. What does it look like? If I'm standing with my wand, I got my arm up high and I'm ready to strike. I'm ready to strike. How does it look? How does it feel? If you're in your power pose, ready to strike, draw that out, and as you do that, cast your spell. Ridiculous! Ridiculous! Cast your spell and make your boggart its most ridiculous form possible. Draw your boggart in the most ridiculous form that you can come up with. If we go back to the scene in in Lupin's classroom, where we have Neville Longbottom with Professor Snape. When Neville casts the spell Ridiculous, Professor Snape is transformed into wearing Neville Longbottom's grandmother's clothing. It's hilarious. And when it comes time for Ron to cast his spell, his ridiculous spell, the spider is now on roller skates and wearing a tutu. The whole class is laughing. It's hilarious. It's so funny to see this happening. And it's nice that the whole class is laughing, but what is more important is that you need to laugh. It needs to make you laugh and give you giggles. That's the most important part. So when I think of my boggart in its most ridiculous form, it's actually 2.5 inches tall. He's a little plastic form. I don't know if you guys can see that very well. Little plastic form. He can't hurt me at 2.5 inches tall. And his little sword, it actually comes out and it bends. So he can't hurt me in any way whatsoever. What is the most ridiculous form of yours? What does it look like to be ridiculous? Create that. Create it as a ridiculous form. Get comfortable with it. Once your boggart is in its most ridiculous form, feel free to take it one step further. Turn your boggart into an elf. In the Harry Potter series, elves must serve the magical community. The house elves are responsible for serving their house, their masters, and they have no other choice but to do that. With the exception of Dobby, who desires and earns his freedom. None of the other elves even want freedom. Even when Hermione is knitting them all little hats, all of them are refusing to take the hat. They have no desire for freedom. They want to serve the magical community. So what task can you assign to your boggart? What task can you have it do to help support you in reaching your big dreams and goals? What is it going to do for you? How will it support you? And so my boggart is my cheerleader. That's what I needed for it to do. And so instead of poking me with his sword, instead of him cutting me down, he pokes and nudges me. He goes like, you got this, you can do this. I'm here for you. His little shield, he thinks he's protecting me. It's hilarious. He can't do anything, but he can poke and prod me and cheer me on and tell me that I've got this, that I can accomplish anything I want. That's what he's doing. So today what we've done is we've created a storyline with a villain, our boggart, you as the hero and the heroine. Then we have brought you together on the same page. And while you're on that page, you need to thank and acknowledge that boggart. Let them know that you're capable of handling the situation. And then cast your spell. Ridiculous. And make your boggart the most ridiculous form possible. What is the most ridiculous form of your boggart? Once it's in its most ridiculous form, assign it a task to support you, that will support you in reaching your big dreams and goals. Now, this is an exercise that you can come back to time and time again. If your boggart decides to mutate, if it decides to take on new characteristics, or maybe you get clarity on what it is, a little deeper clarity on it, redraw your boggart. If you find a stronger, more powerful hero that you look up to, somebody that you admire more, redraw yourself, put yourself in their shoes, and then create the most ridiculous form for you, for that particular boggart, while you're in your most powerful way that you can be. Assign it a task. Make sure it's working for you. You're not working for it. It's not in control. You're in control. And in the end, you are the superhero in your own story. You get to take charge of this. You get to have control of what's happening. I do thank you for your time today. This is the end, but if you enjoyed this, if you found value, please feel free to follow me on social media. I've got Facebook, Instagram, YouTube account, my website, 9 3/4 Coaching. It's all listed under 9 3/4 Coaching. No numbers, all letters spelled out. And if you follow me, you'll notice that every Wednesday I do a Wisdom Wednesday. And on Wisdom Wednesday, I give you some tips and tricks to make it through the rest of the week. But I'm going through the Harry Potter series chapter by chapter, pulling out a coachable moment, talking about what that is and how it might apply to your life and how you might see things a little bit differently. It's a lot of fun. I enjoy doing it, and I'd hope that you would join me in this experience. Have a great week, and I hope that you have amazing experiences in the Community Now mental health event. Thanks so much.